The Australian Financial Review.
Hello, I'm Anthony Macdonald, Chanticleer columnist at the AFR. Welcome to our weekly news breakdown of all things business, finance and markets. Joining me today for the first time this year, he pulls all the strings in here and he's a big fan of the Chook Pod. It's the AFR's Editor-in-Chief, James Chessell. How are you, James?
Happy to be coming off the bench, Ant, and I'm going to give it 110%.
Good to hear. This week we'll discuss when a ceasefire is actually a ceasefire, we'll reveal the AFR's wish list for this year's budget, now only a month away, and we'll take a question on AI job cuts. But first, James, welcome back to the pod.
Thanks,
we love having you on. I think you have one of the best jobs in the country. You get to meet loads of interesting and powerful people, and I think readers of the paper should be able to tell that from the editorials you read. It's a nice mix of politics, business, economics, markets, a bit of everything. But it's been a huge start to this year. James Thompson and I went through it on last week's episode. Then we got our crystal balls out to look ahead. And I'd like you to do a little bit of the same.
Okay.
Before you do, can you please explain to us what's it like running a 24-hour-a-day news operation and a daily paper in this frantic world of Donald Trump and headlines and never know what you're going to get when you wake up in the morning?
Well, on one level, it's exhausting, but it's exhausting for everyone, including many of our readers. On another level, it's very interesting and very stimulating. And during this period, we've gone from a blog that would run for a few hours each day to 24/7 because that's what our audiences demand. The volatility in the markets is something that predates the war and predates Trump for that matter. You've written about it a lot, Ant, but it has been amazing. And I think the AFR provides a really useful service to its subscribers and their readers when there is a lot of volatility around. Our audience wants to make sense of all the uncertainty. They want context, they want analysis, and they also want pieces that look forward. So it's been really an amazing time to be in the newsroom.
Absolutely. What's your most memorable story of 2026 to date?
I could say the obvious things. There's the war. And the other huge theme has been AI, and I'm really proud of the work the newsroom's done on data centres. It's the area where it's probably, in a broad economic sense, having the most impact in Australia. But in terms of the stories that I think were really important that perhaps flew under the radar a little bit, Ron Meisen, our political corro up in Canberra, did a really interesting profile of Paul Erickson. Paul Erickson's the National Secretary of the Labor Party. I think he's been in that job for about 7 years, and he's also been the campaign director for Anthony Albanese in the 22 and 25 victories. And for those keeping score, he's the only the fourth ALP National Secretary to lead a winning campaign from opposition and then go through to win one in government. So he's in a pretty select group. Anyway, he went through in a lot of detail about their thinking in the lead up to the last election, including how they started this big health spending, the Medicare stuff, a long way out. And it just said so much about modern politics. It said so much about the effectiveness of the Labor political machine. And it said a lot about their priorities in terms of spending. We'll get onto that in the section about the budget, but I think I really recommend it to everyone. It tells you a lot about politics, that piece.
Well, good. I knew you'd bring something different. Paul Erickson, that's not a name that we normally kick around on the Chanticleer pod.
He's not a CEO of a top 50 company.
All right. What's been the most surprising story of the year?
Two ones jump out at me. Miriam Robin did a story about two family court judges that were having a relationship. That's important. They had to disclose it to the rest of the family court because of potential conflicts of interest. I thought there'd be a little bit of reader interest in it, but it was absolutely huge and a reminder that people are fascinated by the legal community and judges in particular. And the second one that surprised me was we've got a gun wellness reporter. Like, financial newspapers now don't just do markets, don't just do corporate stuff and a bit of politics. We have to do everything our readers are interested in. So it's really important to have people doing wellness. And we got this guy, I know you know him, Ewan Black. And I said to him, why don't you do something on peptides? Every man of a certain age, and I'm outing myself here, is talking about peptides. Yeah. And I thought it would go okay. And it was the most read thing that week. A huge number of conversions for subscribers. And I think it tells you that there's a big health trend in weight loss, which has been pretty well covered, obviously, and the huge implications of that. But also there's a massive trend in longevity, and the peptides falls into that one. So it was just a reminder that there's a lot of reader interest in staying healthier for longer. That's not an ad for peptides, by the way. The jury is out on the science. I just want to be clear on that.
Okay, crystal ball time. What's a headline we'll be reading later this year?
Politician X accuses supermarkets of price gouging. Not a particularly brave call, but I think it's really interesting. We've just gone through this high inflation event, and we're only just going to sort through the ramifications of this conflict in the Middle East. It's had a massive impact on fuel, and we've learned a lot about resin ant in recent times. True. It's in all packaging. It's related to fuel, and the supermarkets spend a lot of money directly and indirectly on resin. And so prices of groceries by definition will go up. And if I was a supermarket CEO, and keep in mind there's a pretty high-profile AFCCC case going on at the moment, I'd be pretty nervous about what the political class will say about my business as these prices, through no fault of my own, go up, and overlay that with the rise of One Nation, a very populist national party. I think the uneasy ceasefire we've had between politicians and big business might drop away a bit like the opposite in Iran. All
right, two more for you. So we've run a few stories about stagflation and potential recession recently in the past couple of weeks. Do you actually think we could be headed that way this year?
Yeah, I do. And I say that because people like Martin Parkinson, the former Treasury Secretary, raised it as a possibility. He didn't say it will happen, but he said we are looking at potential stagflation. Citigroup's economist said not too long ago, a couple of weeks ago, with growth slowing, inflation, unemployment rising, this is the greatest stagflation risk faced by the Australian economy in the 21st century. So I think it's a real possibility. We already had high domestic inflation before this conflict. That's going to be exacerbated by the fuel spike in the Middle East. And then don't forget that the Treasury downgraded productivity not that long ago either. John Keogh wrote a really good piece on stagflation light, he called it. I think it's a genuine possibility.
All right, last one. You get to meet the most people in the newsroom, I think, or at least the most fascinating and powerful ones. Who's the most interesting person you've met this year?
I'm going to go with Oliver Curtis. One of the big stories this year has obviously been Firmus. You're all across that. In a world where journalism is increasingly done via WhatsApp, via email, I think it's really important to get in front of people and see them. And so when he said he was up for a coffee, I jumped at it. Firmus is potentially going to be the biggest float in the best part of a decade, if I'm correct. And it's at the heart of this data center hype cycle, whether you're a believer or a non-believer. And I came away from it knowing him a little bit better and convinced he was serious about it. I'm not for a minute suggesting Firmus is going to be the success some investors think it will. I'm not saying it won't be either, but it was really good to eyeball him and talk about the business. And he's obviously a really amazing personal story. He's been through a lot, done some terrible things, but trying to rebuild his name. And it's one of the great stories of the year.
Yeah, good nomination. All right, James, that's a great start. I'm going to give you the honours of introducing our first topic for this week.
Where else to start but Iran? The week started with Donald Trump threatening to end Iranian civilization and blow it back to the Stone Age, only for both sides to agree to a 2-week ceasefire while they discussed the finer points of peace plans. The Straits of Hormuz was supposed to reopen. It kind of hasn't. Bombs are still going off in the Middle East. So against that backdrop, Anne, where do you reckon we finish this week?
I think we finish it with one eye on Truth Social, one eye on X to see what the Iranian foreign minister's saying. And in between the eyes, our brains, working overtime to try and reconcile the two, because it's really hard to reconcile the two. It's all pretty fraught. I mean, this ceasefire, as of Friday morning, it's looking better than it did as of Thursday morning, although the guts of it is still about the Strait of Hormuz. The tankers are obviously slow to restart there. You couldn't exactly call it open. It's quite fraught, and Iran and the US, they're going to Pakistan this weekend for talks. There's lots at stake. I mean, if they do get a deal, which I think most of the world's cheering for, you've got to wonder what this whole thing's achieved. I just worried it cemented Iran as a strategic powerhouse in global geopolitics because of the Strait of Hormuz. Almost as soon as the bomb started, it shut the strait. The world freaked out. The world's continued freaking out ever since. And this war's sort of done little for the rest of us except remind us how important the Persian Gulf is, how important Gulf countries are to energy markets, how important energy markets are to everyday life. how interconnected the whole world is. And if it wasn't for the Strait and the Strait being closed, I don't think there'd be the pressure, anywhere near the pressure there is on Donald Trump to end it now. I mean, before all this started, James, like the Strait of Hormuz, it wasn't even in contention. You know, ships were coming and going, 135 a day, as they pleased. Now it's basically Iranian territory. It's ending potentially with Iran charging every tanker, you know, like I said, 135 of them every day. US $2 million to pass through the Strait, maybe sharing that money with Oman that's on the other side of the Strait. But if you're collecting toll payments, you're in control. You know, Trump's pushing back on that toll payment on Friday morning, but it was a big part of Iran's agreement to the ceasefire. So if Iran keeps the toll, if it stays in charge of the Strait, how does the world get that back? And the answer is probably not without a giant fight. And we've seen when you fight Iran, not only do they fight back, but they've got this weapon that can make the rest of the world freak out, which is the Strait of Hormuz. To me, that could be the legacy of this whole thing. So, James, with the actual action itself, it's happening offshore. Like Australia doesn't have a lot to do with it. However, we are being impacted. How would you rate the government's response here?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it's important to note that some of the issues the government has faced, they've inherited, or at least not entirely at fault for. For example, our fuel reserves, which are well below what the International Energy Agency suggests they should be. I think overall the government response has been solid. They've had to tread a pretty difficult line between not panicking everyone, but also being clear about the dangers to fuel security and fuel supply.
Yep.
I think the Prime Minister was pretty widely criticised for the address he did to the nation due to its lack of kind of substantive messages, but it's probably not the end of the world in terms of political decisions. The really interesting thing now is we seem to have got through the worst of it, but we're now going to deal with a very long tail of the impact of the war. The Prime Minister is literally in a Southeast Asian neighbour in Singapore at the moment and building even stronger relationships with the likes of Singapore, with the likes of Malaysia, which is a big exporter of crude oil to Australia, are absolutely critical. The other thing to remember, like this war has just sucked up all our attention in the last almost 5 weeks, but it wasn't that long ago, Carney and our Prime Minister for that matter were talking about how mid-powers like Australia and Canada need to make their own way in the world because we still believe in a rules-based order. So jumping into a war with an erratic US president really does go against that. So the politics of being all in, I reckon, is pretty tricky. And to be fair to the Prime Minister, I'm not sure everyone in Australia would have supported that either. So our ability to make a meaningful difference over there is limited.
Yep.
Meanwhile, Anthony Albanese has flown to Singapore to shore up Australian fuel and diesel supplies. He did another fuel deal before he left. Can you tell us about it, Ant? And do you think these deals are any good?
Yeah, I mean, you said it before, James, Australia's fuel reserve's pretty troubling at times like this. And, you know, day to day, we go through life and you think 30 days is plenty. And normally this whole just-in-time inventory system that we run works really well. But as soon as there's disruption or dislocation in markets, there's a real spanner in the works. Clearly, for times like this, it's just not good enough. I think we'll see that increase once this is all over. That'll be one of the other legacies. But what strikes me is the way that petrol prices go up straight away, James. And as soon as they go up, the whole narrative around this, Australia's position in it, politically, for business, for everyone, it just changes straight away. You know, oil prices go up, petrol prices go up like pretty much that day. And then the complexity of what we're facing for us in Australia really changes. But the government's been talking about underwriting cargoes of refined petrol and diesel to come to Australia. Sort of like it's been talking about turning up in offshore markets and saying, "G'day, mate, we're from Australia. You got any spare fuel?
Yeah.
You know, we can pay you cash. We can pay you in iron ore, coal, gas."
A lot of gas.
Yeah, international students, whatever you want. You know, just send us some of this stuff. And I mean, that plan sounds great. You know, it's another use of your and my money, James, at a time when there's lots of calls for what we should be spending it on. But it sort of falls short if you think about where it goes from there. So say the tankers do come to Australia, what happens when the fuel hits these shores? The government doesn't own the storage and the distribution networks and all that sort of stuff.
Where does a company like Ampol fit in that scenario?
Yeah, so we've got we've got 4 big players that do this, most of the fuel sourcing for us, right? So 2 of them are Australian, Ampol and Viva Energy. The other 2 are BP and ExxonMobil, big global majors. But these guys, they get basically 85% of the wholesale fuel for us. They source it over there. They bring it into Australia. They put it in their tanks. They send it out through their service station or sell it to the independent providers. So we ended up with a solution that, was neat in a way in that the government said, all right, Ampol and Viva, you're our two Aussies that do this. You're in these markets every day. You've got the traders. You've got the expertise. We're just going to get you to do it for us. So the deal they did, so Ampol and Viva, whenever it spots some excess fuel out there, and apparently there is quite a bit, but it might have been excess to their own needs, so they wouldn't have bought it, or it might have been a tiny bit more expensive or a bit further away. They're going to call up the government now and pretty much get a yes straight away, apparently, saying, look, we've spotted this cargo. If you promise us we're not going to lose money on it, we'll bring it back to Australia. So the government's just going to write them a hedge, basically. And I hate to use the word hedge on this podcast, but it's basically just a guarantee that they're not going to lose money on that cargo. It'll bring it back to Australia. And even if there's no room for it in their tanks and it has to float around on a ship, offshore for 6 weeks, the government's going to cover that cost. But it's all about shoring up the fuel supply. And I think my personal view, James, is that it's good to see business doing it. That's what these guys do every day. Yep. The government doesn't do this every day. We've got players that will. But James, obviously Donald Trump's the key protagonist in all this. His behaviour this week was actually pretty shocking if you think about it. Swearing on social media over the weekend, threatening to end Iran as a civilization, something we've never seen from a president or a mainstream political leader, I don't think in our lifetimes.
No.
What?
Well, not since his first term.
Yeah, but strangely, we've sort of come to expect it and we overlooked most of that. How do you sort of make sense of that? And do you think there's a grand plan to all this Donald Trump madness or what?
No, I don't, because if there was, he would have clearly articulated the objectives of this war and had a plan for the Straits of Hormuz. So I don't think there is a grand plan. It seems very reactive. I think it's been a really good conflict for China. I'm not the first person to say that. They've sat back and will benefit from the chaos that has ensued. I think it has pushed Australia into a more forward-facing posture in its region, and I think that's a good thing. I think it's good that the Prime Minister's travelling around Asia at the moment talking about energy. Sovereign capability is going to be a huge theme coming out of this conflict, and so if some good can come out of it, out of Trump's erratic behaviour, it's Australia is more focused on carving its own path rather than relying on old alliances.
And just lastly, James, what do you think the best case scenario is from here? Is it a return to the pre-war status? I don't know. Is it something else?
That's the unanswerable question. And I think if we could go back to pre-war status, we'd take it. That's how low our expectations are. But you do get the sense, you said it before, on this tolling issue, for example, that there could be things could be structurally broken. And this ceasefire, I would say, is fragile at best. So I think it's really difficult to predict how it's going to play out.
Okay, James, time for our second topic. And this is time when you're really going to have to sing for your supper. Like I said, you're in a position that's a bit different to James Thompson and mine. You're wedged smack bang right between the Canberra politics, mainstream business, which means you hear the gripes from both sides, particularly the gripes about each other. And you've got this really unique and probably better rounded picture of what's really going on out there in Australia. We're coming into what is your Christmas, the budget. It's on May 12, exactly 1 month and 2 days away. You'll be in Canberra for it. On a scale between a 5-year-old kid waiting for Santa on Christmas Eve and James Thompson on grand final day and Collingwood's playing, how excited are you for the budget?
Look, they're both pretty excited. Somewhere in between. I grew up in Canberra. My father worked in the Treasury for a very long time. Yeah. So watching the budget on the ABC on budget night was part of our family routine for years and years and years. And he would always get the budget papers and pour through them. So it's been a big part of my life. I think the other exciting thing about this, if it's the right way to put it, is this will be a really important budget. Now, You're looking at me going, all budgets are every budget is important, but some budgets are more important than others. And in fact, this morning we were talking to John Keogh about this is what you do at the AFR. What were the 5 most consequential budgets? And so you're looking at 1942, Ben Chifley, Commonwealth Tax Control of Income Tax. You're looking at the Bill Hayden budget in 75, where you're getting Medicare in the Whitlam government. You're looking at Paul Keating in 83, where he really goes to town on modernising the Australian economy. You're looking at Peter Costello in 96, where we're getting into surpluses and fiscal responsibility. And I'm tossing up between 2020 Josh Frydenberg or the hockey budget. And I'm probably going to go with the hockey budget. It was the last budget where they proposed sort of serious spending cuts. And whatever you think about the budget, and it was probably a sensible plan at the time, it wasn't sold particularly well. And it's kind of set the tone, and this is what John was saying, it's set the tone for the next 10 years or so, in that governments have generally been afraid to put genuine savings measures in front of the population. So that's the top 5 or the top 6. Chalmers is a chance of getting on that list, I think, with this budget. There's so many interesting and challenging factors swirling around. The economy is particularly complicated at the moment, and there's no easy options for the government. It's just absolutely critical.
All right, we're going to get onto the options and the wish list in a second, but just firstly, just consider the politics. Anthony Albanese, not even a year into his second term, he's got a huge majority in terms of seats, plenty of runway. How ambitious do you think he can, A, afford to be, and then how ambitious will he actually be?
Given the economic circumstances, you would hope that he will be ambitious. And the government set the tone a few months ago, both at a prime ministerial level and at the Treasury level, by talking about a reform budget. So they were, as any good government should do, they were sort of letting people know repeatedly that they were going to make some tough decisions. But there's 2 things to take into account. First is obviously the war and its impact on inflation and the lessons it is potentially teaching us about our supply lines and sovereign capability. And if that may well involve more spending than the government perhaps had intended before Trump and Netanyahu started bombing Iran. The second thing is, yes, they have a big majority, but their primary vote wasn't strong by historical standards, just over 30%. And the Prime Minister is a political animal, like most Prime Ministers are, and he's aware that vote is probably more brittle than it appears when you look at the number of seats they hold in the House of Representatives. At the same time, you've got One Nation rising in the polls as well. And while it's mostly eaten away at the coalition's vote, there's no reason why it might start eroding some of Labor's vote as well. So I think you've got the need to be ambitious and the need to reform, butting up against this amazing sort of shock to the global economy and the sort of the base politics in Australia. And that's sort of part of the complexity that they're going to have to navigate between now and May 12th.
Absolutely. All right, let's jump right into it then. Like, we see through your, editorials, you're calling for things, all year round, lots of issues in your head. But if you could put together a budget wish list, what would the AFR really like to see? And what do you think you'll be getting behind in the next couple of weeks ahead of the budget?
So I think it's really useful to look at what the challenges are for the Treasurer and the Prime Minister. The first is our growth. So one of the really key things that happened back in February was the RBA put out its 2-year forecast for growth, and it was the lowest medium-term growth outlook ever published in the bank's forecasting history. I think it only goes back to the 1990s, but
still,
yeah, at about 1.6%. We want a 3 in front of our growth. You and James have talked about that, but the problem is our economy is constrained, and if it gets too hot, and there are supply constraints, inflation goes up, which is what we've seen. We're at about 3.7% annualized inflation, which is well above the band that the RBA wants, which is 2 to 3%. So the key to that, Ant, and I know you know this, is productivity, improving productivity. So, like, to actually answer your question, we'd love to see a budget that, and I know I'm speaking for everyone that runs a business, big or small, in Australia. I'm speaking for a lot of bureaucrats, and I think even sensible union figures would agree that if we can crack the productivity problem in this country, we stand a lot better chance of getting that growth rate up without overheating the economy. And that's the key. Once again, no easy job. And to be fair to the Treasurer, he's not shy about talking about Australia's productivity problem. But, if you want to solve the issues that we face, which is high cost of living, intergenerational inequality, which is another way of saying high cost of housing, you've got to get productivity on the march.
So what are we talking about? Are we talking about tax system changes? Are we talking about IR changes? Are we talking about, deregulation and cutting red tape? Or is it just going to be a combination of all of them?
Well, in a perfect world, it'd be a combination of all those things. I'd also add labour shortages on top of that. You talk to a lot of CEOs. I talk to a lot of CEOs. The labour shortages are a huge issue across big sectors in the economy. Infrastructure and supply chains have been sort of clogged up by huge levels of public and government spending, whether it's at a federal or a state or even a local government level, which is sometimes crowding out the private players. And a favourite subject of you and I, energy costs, Ant. That's another really big problem. Like energy, how many times have we been talking about a policy problem, and it turns out energy is at the heart of that problem. And so high energy costs and all the regulatory compliance that goes with that are inhibiting business, and particularly at a time when we're talking about bringing more manufacturing back to Australia. A lot of that manufacturing is pretty energy intensive, and if your costs are really high and the time to build these things, whether it's a wind farm or a traditional manufacturing plant, are blown out. There's a time value of money, and that's really problematic as well. So it's all those things.
Yeah, I reckon it'd also be good to see that road user charges finally come in, James.
Yeah.
Like the rise of EVs and hybrids, it's only going to get stronger after the war. I mean, they've been around for a while now. We've got lots of readers at the Australian Financial Review that, have their EVs and everything.
Yeah.
Good on them. But these are big, heavy vehicles. They're not paying the tax through purchasing fuel like people that aren't driving their EVs.
Yep.
And I think it's well and truly time to rectify it.
And the other obvious point to make is we're heading into a world where federal government, I'm not even talking about state government debt, federal government debt is about to hit $1 trillion. Now, there'll be some offsets. Commodity prices are up quite a lot over the last couple of years. Inflation has pushed the tax take up. Mm-hmm. And the Treasurer rightly points out, by international standards, we're probably not an outlier, but it is a significant amount of debt. Borrowing costs are going up in a rising interest rate environment, and that inhibits your ability. If you're having to borrow, it inhibits your ability to make all these important changes. We haven't mentioned tax. You could do an entire pod on that. Yeah. The income tax burden is too high on working Australians, particularly, some of the younger generations that are coming up. It goes to the intergenerational inequity argument. We always focus on housing, but tax is a really important part of that. I just wonder, though, in the current political environment, in relation to the Frydenberg budget, which is a big spending budget, it arguably condition people to think that the government could solve all their problems by throwing money at it. What do we think the appetite is among voters for some tough decisions?
Everyone's just so worried about their own back pocket, James, and it's really going to be hard for Australia to overcome that. It's going to take some strong leadership. I mean, we've seen it with this Iran issue with the fuel prices. About 2 weeks after fuel price goes up, they cut the fuel excise in half, 26 cents a litre. Which I get it, everyone on the street, businesses that use fuel, that's great. People now look at the service station as $2.23 a litre instead of $2.50. They think that's great policy. I worry about the extra $2.5 billion in debt that's going to leave us with. So I do think we need strong leadership. I do think we need someone to stand up and say, it's not all roses out there, and we're going to have to go through some tough change in order to make life better for everyone.
And it'd be great if that happens before we hit something like stagflation as well. You don't want to have a recession for the tough decisions to be made. You want to be able to do it when there is a little bit of flexibility in the economy.
Good point, James. All right, I can tell you're very excited about Christmas. 1 month and 2 days away. Good luck in Canberra. We're just going to have a quick break, and we're back to look at what's on next week. Welcome back. If you want to know more about what we're talking about today and a whole lot more, AFR subscribers can sign up to the Chanticleer newsletter at join.afr.com/ facebook.com/Chanticleer. Every Saturday morning, the newsletter pulls together the best Chanticleer columns from the week and delivers them straight to your inbox. James, plenty on next week, second week of school holidays. On Monday, we've got Insignia Financial, big company, owns the MLC Super Fund. Shareholders there will vote to sell the company to private equity for $3.8 billion, which is a decent-sized deal. Then we've got some economic data on Tuesday. We've got the Australian consumer confidence data, which is going to be really interesting because it comes after a couple of rate rises, comes as fuel prices have gone through the roof. How do you reckon the consumer's feeling?
Not confident, Ant.
Yeah. And then on Thursday, we have the unemployment data. Unemployment's at 4.3% last reading. Participation rate was a near record high. Lots of people out there looking for work. But you obviously think it's pretty hard for business to find employees still?
Yeah, I look at the unemployment rate at the moment, and I think particularly certain types of skills, I think it's really tricky. And the immigration, I don't want to sound too defeatist every time I bring up a policy issue, but the immigration debate is going to be really tricky against a background of rising One Nation primary vote. But the government does need to acknowledge that, skilled immigration in the right areas is really important to the health of our economy, as long as the states are providing the services as well, the social services. So that's another tricky one for them to manage.
Electricians, James, your kids, my kids, everyone should be electricians, right?
I totally agree.
All right, we love questions on the Chanticleer podcast. So if you have a question you want to send us in, you can email us at chanticleer@afr.com. You'll find the link in the show notes. Or send us a question in audio form. Just record a voice memo on your phone with your name and where you are from and email it to us. There's also a widget on the bottom of every Chanticleer article, so you can send us a question that way. This week's question, James, came via the widget. It's from Adam in New South Wales, who says, I love the section on the podcast last week, headlines we expect to see in 3 months' time. The big bank AI revolution begins from James Thompson got me thinking. It's well established by the AFR at least that Australia has an oversized and inefficient public sector that is a handbrake on productivity. Recently, we were even treated to the spectacle of Murrumbidgee Council moving to a 4-day week. What I want to know is when can we expect Australia's public sector to find similar efficiencies from AI that we are seeing in the private sector? And James, I just want to add in here that Bendigo Banks, the latest to go through the AI job cuts, announced what's likely to be a few hundred this week. What do you think? The public sector going to get a shake up from AI?
Don't hold your breath, Adam. At the AFR, we're a big believer in incentives. And if you're a private company, one of your key stakeholders is shareholders, obviously, and you're looking at shareholder returns. And you're also looking left and right at your competitors who are probably taking trips to the west coast of the US and talking to Anthropic and other companies. I don't think the public service is as incentivised as the private sector currently. It tends to be reasonably heavily unionised. And one of the really interesting stories of this AI revolution is how the unions negotiate that. They see it as a huge threat, as they understandably would, and they're going to be very resistant to the use of AI in the public service, no matter what they say. But I think the underlying point that Adam is making is that AI is coming. There is no doubt that in the same way Commonwealth Bank could be more efficient if it uses AI sensibly, I think the public service could be more efficient if it uses AI positively. And I think there is a bit of community cynicism, at least from people who work in the private sector, about some of the work from home practices and other things. And while I don't think it will change the public service in the short term, it's a bit like what they say about technology. You overestimate the short-term change and then underestimate the long-term change. And I think they'll be caught up in it like everyone else.
Yeah, I think there was a comment not so subtly hidden inside Adam's question there. Yeah. We're picking up what you're throwing down, Adam. Don't worry about that. All right, James, it's been great to have you on the podcast. Thank you very much. Like I said, enjoy Christmas next month, and we'll get you in again soon.
Thanks, Sam. Pleasure.
If you like the podcast, send it to a friend as it helps others find us. And don't forget to follow wherever you get your podcasts so you'll never miss an episode. At The Financial Review, we investigate the big stories about markets, business and power. For more, go to afr.com and you can subscribe to The Financial Review, the daily habit of successful people. Chanticleer was hosted by me, Anthony Macdonald, with James Chessell joining us this week. It was produced by Alex Gow and our theme music is by Alex Gow. Head of Premium Content is Fiona Buffini.
The Australian Financial Review.